So as you can see, we're in Photoshop. What we're going to be doing today is working on lesson 4, gradients. You're going to need your 3 people standing PNG file. And if you don't have the paper copy of the handout I gave you called Gradient Assignments, it's right here. You could download it and refer to it as you're working. But as always, having a paper handout next to you is the easiest. We already experimented with our gradients. We talked about all the different versions of gradients that are listed up here. Remember, if you hover over anything, it'll tell you the name of it. So we have our linear, gradient, radial, angle, reflected, and diamond. For the first one, you're going to use my file called 3 People Standing to create a perspective cast shadow. A perspective cast shadow is simply the way a shadow would look if the sun or another light source was shining behind whatever object you're talking about. In this case, it's 3 people. And the shadow would be in perspective, meaning it would fall at an angle. And it would also have a darker color closest to the people's feet, and it would get lighter as it moved out, and it would also get blurrier. So we're going to achieve that effect with a variety of techniques in Photoshop. First thing we're going to do is we're going to file, create a new document. We're going to do US paper. 8.5 by 11 is fine, and this time the background content should be white. Go ahead and click OK. What I want you to do is use either one of the gradients you already created, or you can choose a different one. I'm going to choose this one because it's the one that looks most like a sky and some land. I'm going to drop it in. You can take more time with yours. I'm going to actually try to get less sky and more land. Okay. And now it's semi-straight too, so I'm going to go with this. You can be as choosy as you want with yours, and you might want to pick one of these. You can also adjust the presets to be more to your liking. If I wanted to have more of a blue sky, I could choose a different shade of blue. If I wanted grass down here, I could add some green for the grass or whatever I wanted to do. Once your gradient is in there, I want you to choose the PNG file. So you're going to go to place. Once the place pulls up, you're actually going to go to Schoology, but I have mine in a different location. The PNG should drop in. And Photoshop's not responding. Here we go. Hopefully your laptop doesn't take as long as mine. Okay, so we have the people. I'm gonna use a corner and hold shift. Remember, shift constrains your proportions. I'm gonna make my people a little smaller. And I'm gonna move them up here so I have more to work with, and I'm gonna hit enter to place. Okay, next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use one of my selection tools. I like Magic Wand tool. I'm actually going to hide the background. It'll make it easier. And I'm going to select the background. And then I want the people selected, so I'll go to inverse. And now my people are selected. Once I have isolated whatever part of the image, and you're going to follow these same steps later on in part 2 of the assignment, where you're choosing your own images to do the same technique with. But for now, we're going to use the 3 people standing. You want to isolate the 3 people standing. Once you isolate them, right click on the layer panel, choose duplicate layer, hit OK. Then in the duplicated layer, which now has the word copy afterwards, I'm going to right click and I'm going to rasterize the layer. We spoke about what is rasterizing, what does it mean? I looked it up. It simply means that in Photoshop you're taking a layer and converting it to a vector, from a vector layer to a pixel layer. The vector layers create graphics using lines and curves so they maintain their clarity when you enlarge them, but this format leaves them unsuitable for artistic effects that use pixels. So in order to use them, you have to first rasterize the object. So that's the answer to that question. All right, so we rasterized our copy layer. We're going to hit D. I already have black over here as the default, but hit D just to make sure that yours is black for the foreground color. Then you're going to hold Shift, Alt, and Backspace. That's going to turn our copied layer black so we can begin to create the shadow. Control T is going to pull up the transform function. It's called the free transform function. Once you have that, you'll see the little box show up. Right click inside the box and you're going to choose distort. This is going to allow us to create a shadow that looks like it's a shadow. Grab the top middle grab bar and you're going to move this using that adjustment point to get the shadow to look like it's flat on the ground. Remember, if it was a low light, like the sun is going down or just coming in, a shadow would be stretched out. If it was noon and the sun was straight ahead, it would be a very short shadow. But it's up to you, even which angle you want to decide your light source is coming from. I'm going to have them at a midpoint shadow off to the right. You can go any direction or length with yours. It's up to you. Make sure your foreground color is still black. It shouldn't have changed, but if it did, you could hit D to go back to the default. And now you're going to switch to the gradient tool. So you're going to click the gradient tool over here in your toolbar. First, it's asking me, do I want to apply the transformation? I do. Hit apply. And now once we have the gradient tool, up here, I want you to choose the first gradient. It's usually the first one, but hover over it. It should say foreground to background, so that's correct. Yours should be the first one as well. Once you have foreground to background, double click to get it. And then over here in the layers palette, I want you to choose this. Notice there's a little word that says lock. The first one is transparent pixels. Should show up if we hover. But you're going to lock the transparent pixels. When I did that, notice this little lock shows up, telling us that it is indeed locking those transparent pixels. Now you're going to drag the gradient tool from one end of the shadow to the other. You want the gradient to be darkest by the feet, lightest towards the heads. It's going to take a few tries to get that. And you probably don't want white on the shadow so much as shades of gray will be much more realistic. So I'm going to drag my gradient out pretty far to get darker. So once you're happy with the way the gradient looks, you're going to turn off the transparency lock. So back over here to layers. Click the button again. Notice the little lock sign disappears. Now we're going to go up to filter. We're going to choose blur. We're going to choose Gaussian blur. And we're going to enter an 8 for the pixel radius. Notice you can change this by either typing in a number or I can slide it. The higher I go, the less defined the shadow is. So if we have it at a number 8, it's about right for how a shadow would look because the edges of your shadow are usually kind of blurred. So once you get 8 for the blur radius, or you could go up or down a couple depending on what you want for your blur radius. Don't go too crazy. I want you to click that, and then in your layers palette, you're going to drag the layer with the shadows, which is our top layer, down under the next layer. Now, my shadows are not quite under the people, so I would actually move my shadow layer up. I'm just using the arrows because the shadows would usually start about right where the feet are, a little bit under. All right, in order to add more realism, we're going to Control D to deselect. Come over to your toolbar. The second one down is called Rectangle Marquee. Click that. I'm going to have you highlight about from the shoulders up in the shadows only. Once you have that outlined with your rectangle marquee, I want you to go up to Select, choose Modify, choose Feather, and you want at least a 5 feather radius. That's going to further blur or distort or feather the top quarter of your shadow. The further the shadow gets away from us, the more feathered and blurred it is. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And then I'm going to go back to Filter. I'm going to go back to Blur, back to Gaussian Blur. And this time I'm going to add a 6 as my pixel radius. I'm going to click OK. To get rid of the marching ants, I'm going to Control D. And then I'm going to put my background in. So as you can see, it creates a fairly realistic shadow of these 3 people. Once you're done with this, I want you to title it 2 different ways, as always. The first one will be your name _ gradient 1. That will be a JPEG. And the second one is a PSD of the same name. So your name _ gradient 1. When you do this on your own with your own images, you're going to use more than just one set of images. So the 3 people standing is great for learning the technique. But when you create your piece, it should look realistic. Obviously, 3 people in business attire standing in the middle of a desert is not realistic. You're going to use either your self-portraits or your portraits to create a more realistic setting. You're going to start with a gradient again. You're going to drop your images in, and you're going to do the shadow effect with whatever images you have in a way that would make an entire piece of art based on the technique and making it look realistic. So anything that should have a shadow should have a shadow. And keep in mind that in the second one, where you're dropping your own images, shadows should be similar. You shouldn't have short and long shadows within the same piece of art unless you're creating different light sources. It should also be obvious what the light source is, and it could be anything. It could be a flashlight, it could be the sun, it could be a candle. So be creative with your light source as well. Any questions? Ask somebody next to you or me if I'm available.